Good morning. My name is Dan DePetris. I'm a fellow at Defense Priorities, a think tank that is trying to inject realism and restraint in the broader U.S. foreign policy discourse. It's my pleasure to welcome you all for this very important event at a very important time, titled Keeping the U.S. Out of War in the Middle East. And to say that there are a lot of flashpoints in the region today would be the understatement of the century. If you've seen the news over the last 24 hours, CENTCOM recently issued a press release saying that the United States Navy intercepted small boats allegedly carrying Iranian arms for the Houthis in Yemen. Of course, last week we had the U.S. airstrikes in coordination with the United Kingdom against about 70 Houthi targets on land. And this is all coming along the context of the ongoing war in Ukraine. The ongoing war in Gaza and Ukraine. The war in Gaza has reached its 4-month mark. And we're going to talk about all this with three very, very distinguished panelists. The first is Benjamin Friedman, my colleague at Defense Priorities. He is the policy director here. Before coming to Defense Priorities, he worked as a defense analyst at the Cato Institute, and he was a researcher at the Center for Defense Information. Next up, we have Barbara Slavin, who is a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center and a lecturer at the International Affairs at George Washington University. Prior to joining Stimson, she founded and directed the Future of Iran initiative at the Atlantic Council and led a bipartisan task force on Iran. And last but certainly not least, we have Stephen Simon, visiting professor of practice in the Middle East Studies at University of Washington's Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies. He served in a plethora of United States government positions on the National Security Council during the Clinton and Obama administrations. And he also served in positions at the U.S. Department of State. He is the author of Grand Illusion, The Rise and Fall of American Ambition in the Middle East. And on behalf of Defense Priorities, I'd like to welcome all three of you. Thanks for taking the time. I'd like to start out with a very basic question, but I think it's a very important question. Today, in 2024, what do you think are the primary U.S. interests in the Middle East as it stands today? Ben, could you kick it off, and then we'll go to Barbara and Stephen.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And I'll come to our interests as I see them as I go here. Before I talk specifically about that and the escalation risks in the region, I want to make an overarching comment, which is that no law says the United States is compelled to engage in combat on behalf of shipping, the international order, Israel, or some concept of establishing or re-establishing deterrence. And that might seem obvious, I hope it does, but people often tell us we have to do something because of something, situation we've gotten ourselves in, that there's demand for U.S. military presence or even airstrikes that we have to supply, or that we somehow owe a war that might not work, or very well is very unlikely to work to an ally or a partner. So I want to say at the outset that there's always policy choice, and there's nothing automatic here. What is true, however, is that past choices, especially choices about where you stick U.S. military forces, makes getting attacked more likely, and that our recent choices in that regard have us facing risks of escalation in several ways in the Middle East now. Indeed, we've already seen escalation with the Houthis and in some ways in Iraq, but even bigger escalation potentially lurks. So there are three potential avenues, I think, to wider war, maybe with Iran or just a wider kind of insurgency, counterinsurgency, or war against someone like the Houthis. One is getting into a war with Hezbollah on behalf of Israel. I worry that U.S. signals like sending a carrier and rhetorical backing of Israel, which are presumably all meant to deter Hezbollah's escalation, might encourage Israel to be more aggressive. It's a kind of moral hazard in the expectation that we back them. So I think we should be more careful about that. Second avenue of potential escalation is in Syria and or Iraq. especially the latter at the moment, into a full-on counterinsurgency with the real prospect of that becoming some kind of conflict with Iran. Of course, we still have troops in both Syria and Iraq. And the third avenue is the potential for a much broader war with the Houthis, maybe just bombing them continually, maybe doing something even more aggressive, and that too could escalate with Iran. In none of these cases, by the way, do I think that escalation with Iran is probable, because I think both sides, the United States and Iran, are at the moment eager to avoid that. But I do think that could change in a year if we have a different president in the United States. So it's a major concern. Historically, the United States had a big troop presence in the Middle East, primarily to prevent a single state from dominating the region. One logic for this was the worry that with enough oil wealth, a state could be a real problem militarily for the United States or its allies. Another related logic was that that state could mess around with oil supply and maybe tip us into recession. A second idea behind our troop presence was that we were there to prevent big disruptions to oil supply. So slightly different logic. And then after 9/11, you get the idea that we need a big troop presence there to deal with terrorism. I actually don't think that these were ever really good reasons for a big U.S. troop presence in the Gulf and in the region more broadly. That's because of the weak candidates for hegemony, even during the Cold War, the likelihood that a heavy U.S. military troop presence would tend to cause instability more than cure it, and thus oil markets more than calm them, and stir up terrorism more than suppressing it. But regardless of that historical idea, today these rationales really don't make any sense. There's no good candidate for a Middle Eastern hegemon, certainly not Iran, which, while it writes checks to people we wish they wouldn't, lacks the capacity or evident desire to conquer anyone. The U.S. economy is less prone to oil shock caused recessions. There's a small economic literature about this. And anyway, as a net exporter of oil, our interest in continually low prices is less evident. Counterterrorism, as we've learned, I think the hard way, is best done through policing, liaisons with local authorities or forces, and if need be, strikes or raids that don't require much or any even local presence. So that undermines, I think, the idea that we need to stay in Syria and Iraq to contain ISIS, especially given the enthusiasm of all the other local powers to go after ISIS there. So I think really what we're doing there is, in Syria at least, is some kind of regime change light effort to harm the Assad government and also put some sort of pressure on Iran. With the Houthis, I'll skip over and save it for later, but I think we've gotten ourselves into a mess where we've conducted airstrikes that no one thought would work and didn't. And now we're left deciding to quit or go a few more rounds on behalf of shipping with airstrikes that are exceedingly unlikely to solve the problem, both because of the Houthis' motivation for political reasons to continue what they're doing, and because of our inability through airstrikes to reduce their capacity enough to stop them from attacking shipping. So I think there we should keep in mind that, in fact, the damage that's being done to shipping is actually quite minimal, and at least it's not that big an economic problem in the grand scheme of things. The primary people who are suffering as a result are consumers in Europe and China, who are paying slightly higher prices. So I think we have an option not to escalate. In the near term, I see three fixes for the regional trouble we've wandered into. One, tell Israel we're not going to fight for them due to blowback caused by their war in Gaza. Two, get U.S. forces out of Syria tomorrow and Iraq shortly thereafter. Three, seek a diplomatic solution with the Houthis, and while we're at it, start exploring whether Iran is willing to sever its relations with at least some of its regional proxies in exchange for concessions. In the long term, I think what's needed is the realization that, one, Israel's interests aren't the same as ours, and we're better off holding them at arm's length, even while supporting them to a degree, which is how we used to do things, I think, about a generation ago. And then secondly, that there's no compelling reason anymore, if there ever was, for us to try to manage the region's politics. And so we should be heading for the exits. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. Barbara, you're up next.
Thanks so much. There's a lot to unpack there. I agree with some of what Ben said. I disagree with some of what Ben said. If we look at the history of U.S. involvement there, I mean, basically we took over from the Brits, and our involvement increased after the Iranian Revolution, the failed effort to save U.S. hostages in 1979. And then during the Iran-Iraq War, the United States became involved in reflagging Kuwaiti oil tankers and protecting shipping in the Persian Gulf. I still think the United States has a role to play in terms of safeguarding shipping in the Persian Gulf, in the Red Sea. No other power on earth has either the ability or the desire to do it. I was thinking about China, which has been AWOL in all of this. China benefits most from these shipping routes now and needs the oil most. And yet China has refused to take part in this latest U.S. effort to protect shipping against Houthi attacks. So I would try to encourage other countries to step up. But for now, the U.S. is it. And I don't think we can do anything about it. Maybe we don't need the oil so much. But of course, when the price of oil increases, it increases globally and it affects the US economy, affects everyone. So I don't see us getting out of that. I do agree, however, that it was a mistake to bomb Yemen. Haven't we learned anything? Bombing Yemen doesn't really get you anywhere. And the Houthis are actually enjoying now their newfound status as the greatest champion of the Palestinian cause outside of Palestine. And we're doing them a favor, frankly. We were managing to shoot down pretty much all the drones and missiles before. I think we should have confined ourselves to doing that and put our efforts into an end to the war in Gaza, which is, after all, what is fueling all of this, particularly the Houthi attacks. The Biden administration has not been tough enough with the Israelis, and it's time for Joe Biden to pick up the phone and call Bibi and say, enough, stop it. Once the terrible bombardment of Gaza stops, there is a possibility to roll back all the other fighting that's going on these other fronts. In terms of the other U.S. activities in the region, I understand why the U.S. has troops in Iraq. And although the Iraqi government has complained, particularly after the United States assassinated a militia leader in Baghdad, I think you've left that out of your list, Ben. The Iraqi prime minister bitterly complained and so on and talked about getting rid of the U.S. presence there. But I think the Iraqis still value having the Americans there. It's a kind of insurance policy. If the troops go, the embassy perhaps follows, and then Iraq becomes a wholly owned Iranian subsidiary instead of a mostly owned Iranian subsidiary, as it has been for the last few years. In terms of the anti-ISIS campaign in Syria, I think that is legit. And I think there's also the debt that the U.S. feels toward Syrian Kurds who helped defeat ISIS a few years back and who are being bombarded every other day by the Turks, lest we forget. So I think there is some legacy issue there. We have been lucky so far that the war in Gaza has led to skirmishes all around, but not a major regional conflagration. And I've compared it to sort of this giant game of billiards where everybody is making bank shots. And so you attack the wrong target for an injury that you suffered that came from somewhere else. So Iran, for example, bombards Erbil because it's angry that it lost a general to the Israelis in Syria, and because there was a terrorist attack by ISIS in Kerman that looks like it came from ISIS-K and from Afghanistan. So why bomb Erbil? Because the Iranians can get away with bombing Erbil because they know the Iraqis can't do anything about it. And similarly, we see attacks in various places by various parties, settling old scores. The Israelis always on the lookout for a target of convenience, whether it's in Syria or in Beirut. But so far, it has not blown up into a real regional conflagration. And I think if the US would focus on ending the Gaza war and moving on toward some sort of political dimension, we could begin to see a de-escalation in all of these other fronts. At least that is my profound hope. And now Stephen Simon will tell me why I'm wrong.
DePetris will pitch in first.
All right.
I'll pick up at the end.
Stephen, please go right ahead.
Oh, okay. No, seriously, I think if we were to take a mashup of Ben's and Barbara's, takes on the situation in U.S. interests, you'd probably get something close to, a pretty good conceptualization of these interests and what the opportunities and risks are in the region for the United States. They were admirable statements on both parts. To answer, the question that was initially posed by Ben, in the briefest possible way, I'd say, look, U.S. interests in the region are largely secondary or derivative. They're not crucial core interests. Even oil at this point, although I take that issue more seriously than Ben does, I think. It is true that the United States actually, as a principal exporter, a net exporter, in fact, a swing producer of oil, benefits from high oil prices. But if you look at this politically, the benefits of high oil prices go to the shareholders in the big American oil companies, whereas the costs of higher oil prices fall on crucial voters for whatever candidates in any election are competing for a seat in Congress or in the White House. So, the world price does have a powerful political impact on the United States and politics here, which, as we all know, are extremely volatile. Now, what is this secondary or derivative interest? It's mostly just to avoid, to the extent possible, instability in the region, because instability equals unpredictability. And the way in which the United States tends to respond to crises overseas is in a sense regulated by this unpredictability on the one hand and domestic politics on the other. So to avoid scenarios where, any given administration is forced into, an intervention that's really undesirable one way or another, the best way to prevent that is probably to in a sense, stay in to stay out. Now the question is, how much do you want to pay to stay in, and to what extent? What does staying in actually look like? And for the most part, the American posture in the region is quite limited. There are a couple of thousand troops in Iraq, and they're on the way out, not imminently, but there's the administration. If the administration is reelected, there'll be further drawdowns in the future. I don't think that the U.S. currently, particularly the Pentagon, is planning on a forever troop commitment to Iraq. And in Syria, there are about 900 soldiers. There are a lot of American forces that flow through the Persian Gulf. There might be 20,000 U.S. military personnel in the Gulf at any one time. Most of those are going to be, on carriers, on deck or below deck. So they'll be afloat, not really on the ground in any sense, but there's no permanent, there's no significant permanent military presence, particularly ground presence in the Persian Gulf and in other states. That presence is, long disappeared, in Egypt, for example. So, I think that the United States is generally on the right path in the sense that, setting Gaza aside for the moment, it's the U.S. policy hasn't really foreseen a need for a continuing large presence in the Middle East. The large U.S. presence in the Middle East, I think, was something of a an anomaly that really owes to two U.S. wars in Iraq, and those wars are now over, and the troops are mostly gone. So I don't see a real issue there. Now, taking Gaza into consideration, the situation is a bit more complicated. The United States now has something like a quarter of its aircraft carriers in the region, in the Indian Ocean or the Eastern Mediterranean. That's quite a lot. I don't think that that's sustainable, given competing requirements in the India-Pacific region, given tensions with China. So I think they'll be moving out of there. And so I can't honestly say I'm relaxed, but I think we have limited interests, and we'll probably stick to those limited interests and act accordingly.
Thank you all for those very insightful opening remarks. I'd like to kick off the discussion. Barbara, I was especially interested in your point about China, how they've been basically AWOL, and China obviously relies on the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf for, I think, about 50% of their oil imports come from the Persian Gulf. You compare that with U.S. imports of Persian Gulf oil, which I believe the number is about it's declined by about 60% over the last 2 decades. How do you entice China to become more of a leading role, embracing a more leading role in safeguarding freedom of navigation? It seems to me that the administration argues that it's a collective problem requiring a collective solution. So how would you go about doing that?
Yeah, China has been such a free rider in this, and they don't really have the capacity to replace the United States in this way, but they could certainly do more on the diplomatic front. I've been very disappointed that they've, since October 7th, they've basically taken the side of Hamas, and they have, even though they had a budding relationship with Israel, which I thought was important to them. Because they are the major trading partner of pretty much everyone in that part of the world, they could do more. They could be more even-handed, and they could certainly work with Arab countries, others, to make it worth Israel's while to contemplate a diplomatic solution, a political solution, in a way that they just haven't done. There was the sort of low-hanging fruit of the Iran-Saudi agreement that was reached last March, but all of the hard work had been done in advance by others for that, and then they just signed it in Beijing. It's really time for the Chinese. Maybe they don't have the capacity, maybe they don't have the diplomats with the skills required, but they have economic leverage. And I would like to see them use that in a more constructive way. And it's frankly something I've been thinking about a lot since I came to Stimson Center, and a problem that we're going to focus on more.
Ben, you'd like to say something?
Yeah, just one comment on that. Number one, I think that freedom of navigation is a perfectly valid reason for the United States to, invest as it does in naval ships and operations, and we should maintain the ability to open seaways when people like the Houthis try to close them. And I don't particularly have a problem with us being part of this armada that is contesting, trying to protect ships. That said, I think that the United States Navy and others tend to want to create confusion about what freedom of navigation operations require, in that, they sort of see it as a constant peacetime mission, when in fact I think it's a kind of a rare thing. Now is one of those rare times that when we need to open shipping lanes is not really a good rationale for a permanent presence. Traditionally the idea was you do it during a war when your enemies are trying to shut down your shipping lane. So I don't think I'm disagreeing with Barbara. I'm just sort of adding a little color about that. And then on the China thing, I just wanted to say that, of course, there's a chicken and egg problem where, if you want anyone else, whether it's China or Europeans, to do more to help you with these things, it's difficult to get them to do that as long as they can free ride off of our efforts. So, arguably, one way to spur the engine of whomever is to just not do it and see if somebody else picks up the slack. And of course, the Europeans are years away, and actually probably so are the Chinese, from having the naval capacity to do it. But that would at least be, a start. But, and the other thing is that there's this conventional wisdom, right, is that we don't want the Chinese to do anything in the Middle East, in Washington, D.C., because that would be some kind of defeat for our international position. There's this idea that, we're going to leave vacuums behind for them to fill, even in places like Syria, which certainly don't seem like a prize to me. And we need to be very worried about the Chinese, or even the Russians to some extent, taking over. And, I will just say that I wrote a whole paper about why I don't think this is true. I think, number one, I'm not going to go into all that, but I think basically the Chinese don't want the job of doing everything that we've done in the Middle East, even though it's diminished, as Steve says, and everybody should buy his book, which came out last spring about the Middle East. Steve, you can remind me of the title. But the other thing is that I think, if we really wanted to screw the Chinese, getting them to try to take over the U.S. long-term policing role in the Middle East might be a good way to start. So I don't think they'd be that foolish, but I think that, we're thinking about this almost exactly wrong.
I would just add really two things. One is that, we do periodically engage, as Ben said, in these, shipping protection measures, and most significantly in the late 1980s vis-a-vis Iran, where and that ultimately led to a shooting match between Iran and the United States. There's sort of a similar thing going on with the Houthis. Now, sometimes, when the United States decides not to engage in these things, it's a bit of a mistake. So when Lyndon Johnson decided that the United States was not going to, assemble a flotilla to, force access to the Red Sea in 1967, there might not have been a June War, and everything would have been different. Certainly, our conversation here would be different. With the Houthis, in the best of all worlds, it would have been, much better just to, stick, as Barbara was saying, with defensive measures and not attack ground targets. But you could see, given politics in the United States, the way the decision making is made, the way in which the Joint Staff, at the Pentagon, conceives of these operations, as Ben was alluding to, you could see this moving towards attack against ground targets. In the case of the shipping convoys the U.S. pulled together in the late 1980s to protect Iraqi oil against Iranian attacks, the U.S. had the option of, responding to to Iranian attacks against U.S. naval forces by sinking the Iranian Navy, which they did. But the Houthis don't have a navy to speak of. There's nothing really to sink. So if you're going to do anything, you're going to have to hit their shore batteries, as it were. And so that's what we're doing. But is it militarily necessary or really essential for the integrity of shipping operations? Probably not. But the Houthis have their own game to play. A lot of this, they're motivated by domestic political considerations. That is to say, their own internal politics are driving the Houthis towards this very aggressive stance. And as Barbara put it, defender of the Palestinians. On China, I just want to say that this whole conversation actually should be about China. Because if you look at the administration's policy as it evolved from the midpoint to October 6th, 2023, it was all aimed at excluding China during the conflict from assets, resources in the Gulf. And that's what it was about. So China is an important driver in U.S. Middle East policy, and we shouldn't forget that just because of Gaza or what have you.
Can I just add one thing about China, though? I mean, they have taken part, I believe, in patrols against piracy, international coalitions against piracy. There were the Somali pirates that were menacing shipping not so long ago, and they do have a base in Djibouti. So, I mean, they could be part of a protection mission if they wanted to be. And I don't know if any effort has been made to get them to do it, but, so far they haven't. Also, apparently the Houthis have been targeting Western shipping, but avoiding Russian and Chinese shipping. So, yeah. Maybe that's another reason why they haven't gotten involved.
Great, thank you. I want to shift the discussion a little bit about these, recent strikes that took place last week on Houthi targets in Yemen, and of course, this comes at the time when the United States also engages in retaliatory airstrikes in Iraq and Syria against Iran-backed militias who have been essentially taking pot shots at U.S. bases in both countries with missiles and one-way attack drones. The administration makes this point often in their press releases about deterrence. We're basically retaliating not only to degrade the capabilities of these militias, but to prevent them from attacking U.S. troops in the future. It seems to me that strategy clearly isn't working, depending, if somebody who has an ounce of common sense can see that. Why does the administration, in your opinion, keep on using the deterrence language when all evidence seems to be that we're not really deterring anything at this point? Ben, would you like to go first, and then we'll go to Stephen, and then Barbara, you can close it out for us.
Yeah, I don't have a good story about their linguistic choices. I think that they've gotten themselves in a situation where U.S. forces are taking fire continually in both countries, and they feel compelled politically to do something about it. And they also want to avoid, I think, really major escalation. So this is sort of the middle ground that they've settled on. I don't think they're suffering still from the misconception, if they ever did, that it's going to put a stop to it. But I think it's just sort of the best idea they can come up with, given all the other factors they're considering. I think to understand deterrence with any group or country, you have to look at the politics of that group or country and the motivation they have for doing the thing you don't want them to do. And in Iraq, you're talking about a bunch of different groups. So I wouldn't say across the board everybody there is undeterrable by airstrikes, but clearly the main actors are not overly bothered by the retaliatory airstrikes the United States has done. With the Houthis, as Steve already said, they clearly see a large political benefit to casting themselves in this role as standing up for Gaza and also potentially against Israel and also potentially the United States now. We're not deterring them. Beyond that, if you look at it from a capability standpoint, and the same goes, I think, in Iraq and Syria, the kind of arms you need, whether they're anti-ship ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, or drones, plus you need some radar. The kind of arms you need to do this stuff is just, I think, proliferated a lot. It's cheaper. At the same time, they're not terribly effective, the Houthis. I mean, I think they've hit about 4 or 5 targets in the course of 30 attacks, and they haven't sunk any ships. They've just done damage to them. So it's getting easier to do it. They're pretty well motivated. So I don't think anybody thought that this first round of airstrikes to 70 targets would work. I think even Biden administration officials were saying right off the bat, we expect that they'll keep going with the attacks. So, I mean, that's why I started off my remarks by saying, there's no law that says we have to do a dumb airstrike, dumb in the sense that almost nobody thinks it's going to work, and you're going to be left in a situation where, you either escalate or seem to back down. So I think it's very unpopular to say, I guess, because people perceive the Houthis to be terrorists, which I don't think is really true. I mean, they're basically a state. And people think, well, you don't give terrorists or hostage takers what they want. But the fact is, we give states what they want when they use coercion regularly. I mean, that's a big part of international politics. So the idea that we could cut a deal with the Houthis where we say, okay, we'll let more aid into Gaza, which is, by the way, all they said, at least until recently. That's what they didn't even say ceasefire in most of the messages. They just said more aid into Gaza. Strikes me as a very reasonable demand, even if they're making, you find the means they're using for to get it to be unreasonable. So, it's part of a sort of pathology, I think, that that we have in Washington, where it's verboten to just say, well, why don't we just give them what they want? We can do a lot of other things. We can sanction them and say mean things about them at the same time. But if we give them what they want, they might stop. And that, and I don't disagree with Barbara that it would be better to, push for a ceasefire. But, in the meantime, maybe we could give them something halfway and see if it solves the problem before we bomb them. And then are confronted with the possibility of bombing them again. Sorry to go on so much, but it's an important question.
Please go ahead, Barbara. Or, sorry, Stephen. Please go ahead. And then Barbara, you can.
Over to you, Barbara.
All right, if you insist. Give them what they want. I think that the demands that they're making are actually not that unreasonable, and that would be nice. But of course, you're leaving out the domestic political context in which Joe Biden is constantly being accused of being soft on Iran. All of this is blamed on Iran. Starting with of course Bibi. Almost immediately after the attacks of October 7th, saying it's Iran, even though obviously it was Hamas, and Hamas apparently did not bother to tell the Iranians what it was going to do. So it's an election year. Biden feels he has to look tough, and as I say, this is it's a massive game of deflection where the U.S. doesn't want to attack Iran directly, so it attacks the Houthis. It picks and chooses targets that it thinks will not lead to a wider war. Israel is opportunistic. It sees opportunities. It goes and it takes out whoever it can, whether it's an IRGC general in Syria or it's a Hamas leader in Beirut. But the parameters of the conflict have remained so far the same. And I think if we can get a de-escalation in Gaza, if we can get humanitarian aid, which is desperately needed and get the Israelis to stop, I'm really worried that the Israelis are pushing to extend this into Lebanon. Everything I'm hearing suggests that the Israelis really want to go in and go after Hezbollah now in a major way, as if they haven't done enough damage in Gaza. And it's Bibi doesn't want the war to end, because when the war ends, his career ends. And so I think the United States has to be much more involved, not in bombing Houthis, but in reading the riot act to Bibi Netanyahu. Stephen,
please go ahead.
On the deterrence, question, the way these, public statements are done is through cut and paste. And, about 60 years ago, the word deterrence was first used in one of these, statements, and it's been cut and pasted ever since into, the succeeding 10,000 remarks from the White House or the Pentagon or briefers or whatever. Deterrence is just, it's a figure of speech. It's an essential part of the rhetoric. Nobody thinks too carefully about it, I suspect. Deterrence does play a role here, but it should be more in the realm of deterrence by denial, and denial is not just the name of a river in Egypt. This is an important strategic concept. And there are various ways, there are various approaches to deterrence. And one of them is you deter by simply making the other guy's attacks ineffectual, and at some point simply not worth carrying out. And that is what the United States and others were doing by focusing on defense. So the Houthi objectives were denied through a defensive approach rather than an offensive one. But as Barbara was saying, the deck was stacked, politically on both sides in a way, toward ground attacks. There wasn't much of an alternative to that. I think the question, well, could we negotiate with the Houthis on this, strike some kind of bargain, is a good one. And I don't think that we talk to the Houthis, here. So that's that's an issue that we need to be thinking about, because perhaps there might be some defined actions that the United States could take that would incentivize the Houthis to stop their attacks. We don't really know. Now, if there's a political scientist out there, I don't think he's a political scientist. I think he's an anthropologist. But if there's any scholar out there who can explain, what the Houthis are doing, it's Ben Anderson. This is an issue of imagined communities, and that's pretty strong. I mean, it's what the medieval Arab commentators would have called asabiya. I mean, it's tribal affinity, and affiliation. In fact, political scientists nowadays talk about affinity groups. Well, there you have it. And it's a pretty effective pull. So I'm not sure that negotiations along these lines would necessarily be productive, but they could be undertaken. And there are certainly intermediaries, particularly the UN in Yemen, who would be in a position to do this, and that would be worth exploring.
Ben, did you want to add something?
No, I think we can keep rolling.
Great. I want to switch to Syria specifically. As we know, we have about 900 U.S. troops in Syria across a constellation of very small bases, mainly in northeast Syria, but we also have a base in Al Tanf, which is, of course, in the south, kind of bordering Jordan and Iraq. I'm kind of wondering, sort of like, why. I guess it's a simple question, but why are we still there? And I ask this because the original mission when the Obama administration originally started its bombing campaign against ISIS was to eliminate the ISIS caliphate, and that seemed to me it was a measurable objective. You could see how much territory ISIS controlled at any given time. But we sort of switched to the enduring defeat of ISIS, which, at least to my eyes, suggests that it's almost an ongoing mission with no end state. So I was wondering, would it be so bad if U.S. troops pulled out of Syria? The conventional wisdom is yes, it would be, but is that correct in your estimation? Stephen, Barbara, and then Ben, if you could close it out.
You can see I'm not really adept with technology. We've got the United States has a small number of troops in Syria, as you said, about 900, and they are scattered. They are scattered, but they're really, let's say, concentrated in two different places. One in the northeast, and the other is by Atanf in southern Syria, where Iraq, Syria, and Jordan meet. Sort of that place. There's a big highway that runs through there, so it's kind of important. Would the sky fall if the United States pulled its 900 troops out of Syria? I don't think so. The reason, as I understand it, anyway, the reason that the United States is keeping troops there are as follows. First is to, in a sense, cauterize the Iraqi border so that ISIS fighters can't enter Iraq from Syria and cause trouble to the extent that they can in Iraq, which is just really getting back on its feet. The second is to keep pressure on what was the heartland of ISIS control in Syria. I don't know how important that is at this point, but there are a complex of camps that house thousands of former ISIS or maybe current ISIS personnel and their families. And these camps are a source of serious anxiety, at least to the United States, because if control over those camps and the area in which they're situated was forfeited, then people have an image of the alien bursting out from the belly of the technician on the aircraft. It's like all of a sudden, you'll get this inundation of ISIS people. There's the Kurdish factor that Barbara referred to. That's important from the perspective of U.S. domestic politics. Primarily, it's not a strategic interest on the part of the United States. So I think, from Washington's perspective, when you weigh all these interests, none of which are really crucial, but they sort of add up to something a little bit more crucial, then the cost the United States is paying, to protect those interests is small enough to make it worthwhile. But I think this is just a classic case of the investment is proportional to the risk that you're trying to avoid, through the investment. And you can see the investment is small and it's commensurate, to the interest. But I think if they were pulled out, I think we'd be fine, at least until November 2024.
Yeah.
Barbara, you disagree, it seems.
Well, I largely agree. I think I would have been more comfortable with pulling those troops out before October 7th. After October 7th, I think there has been such a stirring up of anti-American and jihadi sentiment because of the Israeli retaliation on Gaza that there are some new vulnerabilities. Not that I think that ISIS is going to reemerge and go after the U.S. homeland. I mean, it never really did anyway. It was going after regional targets more than the U.S. homeland. But you do have ISIS-K in Afghanistan. I think it's useful to keep an eye on those former and perhaps current jihadis. And I think it's also useful for the U.S. to be able to see what goes in and out of Syria from Iraq and from Iran in terms of intelligence value, perhaps intercepting some of the material that comes through there. So ultimately, I think it's worth it. I also think that it complements the Americans in Iraq. It's a small presence. We paid such a heavy price, and people in that region paid such a heavy price for the U.S. intervention in 2003, that it's kind of the least we can do to at least try to keep an eye on things and defend some minimal interests there. And I agree with Stephen. I think it does protect the Iraqis against more cross-border terrorism, and so it's worthwhile.
Well, at last, we finally disagree a lot. I don't agree. I think the fact that things have been stirred up since October 7th in the region, and therefore the incoming has increased in its pace a lot in Syria and Iraq. Incoming fire on U.S. troops, luckily no one's been killed, is not a reason that we should be there. It seems to me more like the opposite. It's more a hornet's nest. I think, it's a small presence, but I think it's like an off-balance sheet liability. In fact, the size of the presence isn't really the issue. Arguably, we just have enough troops there that they can get into trouble and get attacked, be targeted by these, more and more accurate long-range fires that are falling into more hands of, rebels and insurgents and different groups. So I think those are reasons to go. As far as the Kurds go, I think there has to be a terminus to our debt to them. And when Trump said we're pulling out of Syria, he pretended we were leaving Syria and then didn't. I wrote an article saying I think he's right, but we do need to kind of resolve the situation with the Kurds before we skedaddle. But that was a few years ago now. I mean, we need to be telling the Kurds, if we're not there forever. And I think in some ways, by just sitting on them and protecting them from Turkey, we're pushing away the day when they achieve some sort of lasting political reconciliation with their circumstances, which is a common pattern in U.S. foreign policy. So, I don't think we should leave tomorrow and just leave them high and dry to get attacked by Turkey. But I do think that they should be informed that it's time to cut some sort of political deal. I mean, I think that, the status quo ante before the Syrian civil war was, not the land of milk and honey for the Kurds there, but, they weren't getting killed. And I think that, they might be able to do that. So, I'm quite worried that what we're doing in Syria, while it has a low cost at the moment, has explosive potential costs, even if they're low probability, right? From a sort of cost benefit standpoint, you could get into a war with Iran, particularly if we have certain presidents in a year, and you could even get into, like in Iraq, we skipped the big counterinsurgency campaign against the Shiite community. We had some of that, but it seems like we're potentially going to rerun history so that we can have it this time around. So I think there are some not necessarily probable, but extreme risks, not to mention escalation with Russia in the region that are not captured in the day-to-day cost.
Well, we're coming up at 5 minutes to the top of the hour, and I guess I'd like to ask each and every one of you. Obviously we're in election year. We don't know who the next president of the United States is going to be. Would you think, regardless of who that may be, what do you think are your top two, I would say, recommendations for the next administration, whether it's Biden, Trump, or somebody else, as it pertains to U.S. grand strategy in the Middle East, Iraq, Syria, Yemen. What are your thoughts? Your top two takeaways, Stephen, Barbara, and then Ben. You can close out for us.
Thanks, Dan. Look, my main recommendation for the next administration is, recognizing that the other guy gets a vote, is not to deepen U.S. activities, engagement in the region, on the security side. That would be a bad idea. I think the pre-Gaza glide path was the right one. We could probably accelerate that glide path. I'd have thought, but I would encourage the administration to think in those terms. And relatedly, to be sure, and this is an extremely difficult thing for any administration to do, and will be after 2024, is to try to align limited U.S. interest in the region with what we actually do there. And that's a tough thing to do, but that's what I would encourage the next administration to do, and to keep us and to think carefully about the way in which U.S. involvement in the region will be or could be affected by fears regarding Chinese access to the resources, of the region, because that's the next big temptation to get seriously involved. And we saw that actually with the administration's offer of security guarantees to Saudi Arabia last year. Thank you.
Barbara, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I would put the energy into diplomacy. If it's Biden's second term, obviously he's got a lot freer hand with a number of different parties in the region. Typically, we see more from second-term Democrats. That's when we've made progress with Iran under Clinton and under Obama. Iran is a very difficult case, obviously. Things have been going all in the wrong direction since the U.S. quit the nuclear deal in 2018. But that doesn't mean it's too late to try some sort of new process, some sort of new understanding. Sanctions have failed. Iran is selling more oil now than it has in years, albeit at a big discount. And U.S. policy has frankly just strengthened so-called hardline elements. We might get lucky. Ayatollah Khamenei might pass from the scene. There might be some new personalities to deal with in Iran. And if we could improve the U.S.-Iran relationship, obviously that would have an impact on all of Iran's various partners and proxies. We have to work with the Israelis. Their policy toward Palestine, toward Palestinians, has blown up literally in their faces. It's time to get serious about some kind of improvement in Palestinian rights and living situation on the West Bank and in Gaza. There's going to be a lot of rebuilding to do. That will be a project that will take years and years and years in Gaza. So that's where I'd put my money and resources rather than into more military adventures.
Thank you. Ben, real quick.
Don't give Saudi Arabia security guarantees. I think that might be revived depending on what happens in Gaza sooner or later. I hope that Steve's right that we were on a glide path to sort of slow disengagement, but I worry that desire was quite contrary to that, giving them security guarantees, and would maybe require a lot more from the United States. I wouldn't worry about China. I already said why. We don't need to worry about them taking over in some important way. And finally, I think that there needs to be threat deflation around Iran. I think a lot of these problems that I outlined, these specific recommendations I have, kind of flow from that. This idea that they're the great Satan pulling the strings. There's not zero truth in that, but their capabilities are quite limited, and I think it's really possible for us just not to worry about them so much and let a regional balance of power take care of things much more than we've been willing to do in the past. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Ben Friedman, Barbara Slavin, Stephen Simon. Thank you for Defense Priorities for hosting this event, and stay tuned for additional events in the future. Bye.
Thank you.